name is Lina Dib, and I would like to invite everybody to introduce themselves. Who's next?
All right, I can go. So I'm Lina Dib. I am an artist. I'm an anthropologist. I like to tinker and I like to write and think and all those fun things that I think a lot of us here do. I am currently in Houston, Texas. I was born and raised at Montreal. And here 30 degrees is the start of our autumn.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Kite. I'm a PhD student candidate at Concordia University, lecturer at McGill, and I'm currently in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where it is also nice and hot.
Jonathan?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan Stern. I'm a professor at McGill University. I'm currently in Montreal and wearing a cashmere sweater. I see Navid's got a scarf on, it looks like. Yeah. Got to stay warm. So yeah, I'm a professor at McGill. I write on the history and philosophy of sound. I'm doing a new project on AI, like everybody else under the sun, I think. And I also make sound and music and do things like that.
Hi everyone, I'm Navid Navab, and I co-direct the Topological Media Lab and have a life as a PhD student, as an artist as well. And I often look into trippy material processes and try to orchestrate states of sensory access to those material processes that feel alive, right somewhere between life and non-life. And that's my current passion, at least. And I'm co-moderating and co-organizing this event with Nina.
Yes, and I am an artist and a researcher and a curator, and I work with art, science, and technology. And this Sensory Cosmologies participatory discussion includes, as you can hear, artists and theorists and practitioners who explore a wide spectrum of topics ranging from holistic sensory practices to ethical aesthetic paradigms. Cosmology is the scientific study of the origin, evolution, and eventual fate of the universe. It can also be approached from the wholeness and the implicate order theory by David Bohm, theoretical physicist. The hollow movement, according to Bohmian interpretation, brings together the holistic principle of undivided wholeness with the idea that everything is connected and everything is in a state of process or becoming. According to David House, sensorium, meaning the entire perceptual apparatus as an operational complex, is an ever-shifting social and historical construct. The perceptual is cultural and political, and not simply a matter of cognitive processing or neurological mechanism located in the individual subject. Every act of sensing has a social lining, as well as a psychological and physical lining. Conceiving of media as extensions of the senses, after McLuhan, underlines both the rootedness of the media in bodily praxis and the way in which the senses mediate experience. Over to you, Navid.
Okay, thank you, Nina, for a great introduction. And yeah, for so many cosmologies that we know center humans far too much. And often cosmology is about our place in the universe, but not necessarily our place as leading the universe. So this brings up the question of life. And the way the panel is organized in the beginning is going to be less direct questions with yes or no answers and more like a series of questions to provoke our participants who are going to draw on their practices and knowledge to provoke us back, and then we'll end up with a dialogue. So the first provocation that we have is, how can our transformations, material, social, or else, best preserve the life of things? And what is life anyways? What is life to you? What does that mean? What feels alive to you? in your practice, do you find yourself sometimes examining and considering degrees of life and liveliness in things beyond the definitions that you see in biological systems, for example, in terms of metabolic systems, sidestepping those, and, for example, looking at other relevant notions, whether it's entropy versus order and chaos, or even notions of excitability and responsiveness, or even to other notions that you might come up with intuitively, feeling the life in things. So what are those notions to you? And of course, the implications here of the notions of liveliness that you project onto your subject matter, the implications range from practical in design and technique to social, ethical, and ecological. Do you find yourself one way of thinking versus another in orchestration of life-preserving transformations help you? Basically, do you approach the life in something to try to preserve it in your process, be it design or performance? Does anyone want to open up by brief remarks or reprovocations based on that?
I can start perhaps, and maybe it'll throw in some keywords or ways that I hesitate to think about things as alive, but at the same time, I think take for granted the fact that everything is somewhat connected and therefore alive. And so when I'm hearing you speak about liveliness, a key term that keeps coming back to me is that of relationships. So that life comes through relationships, or this concept of liveliness. We don't exist in a vacuum. And that's something that I constantly also tell my students. I teach at Rice classes on art and environment, and really try to discuss ways of creating works that emphasize the fact that we're not sort of existing in these isolated systems. And so my creative work tries to do that. I create these interactive installations, sometimes these sonic kind of contemplative spaces as well. And they're meant to highlight, yes, our relationship to nature, but also our relationships to each other. And also, because of the theme of this year's conference, that a lot of people are talking about AI and what is sentience. And then I think back and I'm like, oh, well, there's something really simple about the pieces I make. There's an interactivity, but that is felt. It isn't so much that the piece does have a life of its own, but then it also, I try to create a sense of agency in the participant, so that to do that, I keep things fairly simple, so that I'm not trying to create an entire living system like artists might have done in the 60s and 70s, but instead create works that act as lures to help us think about living systems, but that the goal isn't to create an entire living system. I don't know if that kind of throws some things out there, but so the notions of responsibility, relationships.
So I see Jonathan raising your hands. I will let you actually go on.
So first, thanks to Navid for calling me a cosmonaut. I always wanted to be a cosmonaut, so now I'm a cosmonaut. So
always have been.
Yeah, well, it's good to achieve things you've always wanted. So I like Lina's point about relationships a lot. And it's funny, I've been reading in the new materialism for years, and this sort of, we need to get beyond the human and reevaluate relationships to things. But because of the kinds of culture and technology I write about, I guess in some ways it's less of a concern for me. I'm not so excited about the brain metaphors in an artificial neural network or something like that. But one of the places I do think a lot about life is the life cycle of objects and the relationship of an object to obsolescence. Melissa Gregg just published this interesting ethnographic piece about people's ambivalent relationships to digital devices that have been rendered often obsolete, not because they're not usable anymore, but because the company has made them not usable, because a standard has evolved, something like that. And if you want to talk about sort of human responsibility to the planet, it would be interesting to imagine that people have more responsibilities to our devices than to simply abandon them. Of course, that starts at the top, like at a corporate level, at an ecological level. I mean, there's actually even legal experiments with this, like extended product responsibility. If you buy technologies made in certain places, they'll have instructions for disposal right in the user manual, which I think is mind-boggling, that we're already like making and buying these durable things that we then are already expecting to sort of supersede, when many objects throughout human history were meant to be reused and preserved in not necessarily in perpetuity, but indefinitely, until they really, really weren't usable again. And so when I think about life in things, I really think a lot about use life and how that relates to human and animal life on the planet. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Suzanne, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely in the realm of things that I think about and write about primarily. And in my work, I think the idea of transformation is very key to understanding a Lakota way of seeing not only objects, but like dissolving that word objects completely, and understanding both the body and all material things as coming from a place and going to a place and being in constant state of transformation. Some things in special states of transformation, like a hot stone in a sweat lodge, slowly becoming dust again, but quickly because of the fire and the constant heat pressure. And what that transformation of that stone does to the water, and then what that transformation of the water into the air does to the human body, and then to the human spirit. So in thinking about life and liveliness, especially in thinking about AI, I think that the way that I think about sound is, and the way I'm approaching this whole panel is I'm trying to work through this idea of the body as both a static, not static object, but a channeling, transformative object, which hears sound and then transforms sound by the act of listening. So I think that, you know, all your questions they bring up, the whole point of this approaching sound and object and AI like this is to generate ethics, is to see the body in its context, in its relations, just like you said, and see it as capable of being in ethical relations. So, and I think very key to this is it's the Lakota philosophy and Lakota ontology, and seeing the body in this way and seeing it as a being near other beings is, and not seeing it like it's like the anatomy of the listening body needs to change, and listening as like not is listening to the beyond, not listening just to sound waves, listening to objects, listening to non-human entities that are literally make up everything, even if they're human-made. So that's my approach, and that's what I write about in the recent position paper, Indigenous Protocols and Artificial Intelligence.
So many points were brought up that we will come back to later, specifically about the body and AI. Some points that directly I wanted to wrap up about this question. Number one was regarding forms of life and forms of transformation that go together for designers and artists. So it seems important that when we design, things transform. So design sometimes is about, maybe an unhealthy way of thinking about design is about controlling nature, but a healthier way about that is channeling something from within it, preserving the life in it, respecting it, and transforming it to become something useful to you and others. So this means that we have to come up with alternative notions of what is lively and alive. And that was the point of this question of, we can't just consider something that breathes and is metabolic alive, but sometimes you might look at a rotting piece of wood and feel that it's very alive, but a piece of plexiglass might feel dead. So what happens if you put something within a geometric and spatial and temporal landscape that disturbs it by adding something that's far too controlled? So These are questions of life transforming transformations that we heard different people taking to different places in their practice. Now, Nina, Lina, Suzanne, Jonathan, do you want to add anything to your own thoughts or other people's thoughts or respond to them?
I would like to say something about the transformation. We talk now about this transformation much more often. For centuries, the human body was depicted in either two-dimensional or three-dimensional ways, but very little was talked about the transformation of the body or the transformation of objects. It's quite a new and novel idea to discuss. What is other people's view on this?
I like this notion of transformation, especially because I am 37 and a half weeks pregnant, so there's a lot of transformation going on. But also, I liked what Suzanne had brought up in terms of thinking through things, and that being sort of a bodily practice as well, and then connecting that to sound studies, because there were some discussions, especially a few years ago, about absolving ourselves from the term soundscape and instead adopting the term atmosphere as a way of being in and perhaps a part of, and then with Stephen Helmreich at MIT thinking in terms of transmutations. And I think that might be an interesting way to connect some of these conversations about transformation and also things changing and thinking through things literally. So those are some other things that have kind of concepts that came to mind listening to you both.
So process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll bounce off Lina. I obviously can't say anything about being pregnant, but the question about transforming bodies, I think, is really important. I just finished a book manuscript that's like getting sent back to the press next week, actually, on impairment and impairment phenomenology. And it's precisely this idea of sort of short-circuited capacities that I think really promises a lot for thinking the human, thinking limits in new ways, but also mainstreaming ideas that have been central to a number of, you could say, minoritarian streams of thought. For that book, I use disability theory a lot, but you can find it in other traditions as well. So that part of it, I think, is actually really important. The other thing, along with transformations, is the idea of transduction, which is conversion of one energy into another. Stefan has a great piece on transduction as well. And like, in terms of how I think about sound, especially, that's absolutely essential, is that sound is never just sound. It's actually lots of different things depending on where it is and what's happening.
I'm kind of, there's one idea that I've not named, but I've been thinking about the way, as you said, Navid, like design can help us. Thinking about when design is used, or like historical designs or traditional designs, where you're taking, what's the difference between taking something and just material and designing it with a really long historical history of a design, or making something new, and what are the different all of those histories and the energy in those histories helping you do that symbolic transformation within whatever you're designing. And I think that's, you're channeling from different directions. And in part of my research in asking my grandfather, who does traditional Lakota medicine, asking him, if he hears a new song, and he doesn't use the word composing or improvising. When I ask him, where did you hear that new song? Where does it come from? First of all, it comes from like the beyond, but then he's like, oh, it comes from right here. It's like, it comes from the physical body, and it's through what I'm one of the frameworks I'm thinking about now, because I feel like it's one thing to understand these things. It's another challenge to transform design through ethical frameworks, and to say, well, we want to do it in a good way, so here's how we're going to do it. And one way I'm thinking about this is these looking into these things called these twisters, which look like light cones, and they can be macrocosmic or microcosmic. They're called Printemps, Lakota, and they're a design for a vortex of communicating with the beyond. And I think about them a lot, and I think that they're like the symbol of transformation for me right now, and thinking about taking what's earthly or material and listen, and finding a way to listen further through symbols and through semiotics.
Thank you, Suzanne. That's looks like I wanted to hold the questions about the body as a place for transformation and transduction, but looks like we're there. So let's go there. So in your work and in everyone's work here, we're negotiating different stakeholders when we design, whether a tool or an experience or an event of art, which means that part of us needs to tap into part of something else we're engaging in, is the part that feels alive to us, and working with it to negotiate who's saying what and make sure that the stakeholders are given respect. So then we go back to the question of senses, because we have to use our senses to connect with a sense of sense within something else and ask it what it wants instead of deciding for it. So our next provocation is about sentience and the senses. As artists, educators, and multidisciplinary cosmonauts here, we often need to exert some degree of determinism or control over the concepts or precepts that we like to bring into the world and provoke within our audiences. We need to make calculated jumps and leaps from rich concepts that are within our head and within our designs. It's not like that for everyone, to executed actions, basically orchestrating contingency within performance, installation, within nature, design, literature. And we do this in the hope of either communicating something specific or orchestrating conditions of engagement between different stakeholders, let's call it. Modulating fields of relation to enact certain affects and percepts. So it's about managing forms of engagement, and forms of engagement imply forms of sentience. So it's becoming related to our first question at this point. When preparing to make such leaps of action, do you find yourself rethinking the senses and trying to think through some other being's senses? That means that you have to transport your thinking into the aliveness of the river and its senses, and then imagine what the river wants to tell you. And engaging with different sense-making assemblages, leveraging their blurry boundaries, modulating their multisensory entanglements, and developing strategies for engaging humans and non-humans. And artists and designers are good at hacking the blurry places in the senses where they bleed into each other, where sound becomes light and vice versa. So what ways of engaging the senses have been constructive for you? For example, in reference to your work, or some of the stuff that you've done is welcome, so the audience can also dive into your works in a situated way. Have you had examples of being able to connect people to the sense-making apparatus within something else? And you've had, as an artist, had to put yourself in your audience's shoes, in their own cultural context, make leaps of faith and action and engagement. So anyone wants to go for that? Long questions.
I can start and sort of follow with the first sort of set of questions, where I was saying my goal isn't especially the multi-channel large-scale installations, it's not to create every sense. I'm not trying to recreate a particular forest where we hear an ivory-billed woodpecker that hasn't been seen in over a decade, etc. So it's not about recreating the past or recreating a particular place, or even being didactic in that sense. Like, we have Sir David Attenborough for that, and that's wonderful. but I still use these elements of nature to pull people into maybe thinking more about our place in complex natural systems. So again, ecological systems as being about relationships with nature, but also with each other. And so I do that by keeping things fairly simple and engaging sound, or making the interactivity somewhat predictable, so that, let's say someone moves a certain way or moves closer to a screen, then they can start to push back on waves. One of the pieces I've done in the last couple years is a large video of a wave or of the beach, and as you move closer to it, you can sort of slow it down with your body. It's an homage to Thierry Kuncel and Andy Warhol's Sunsets, but then you can also start to kind of liquefy the image with your body. And it's a reflection on power, on how we like to think we can control nature, especially in Houston with the hurricanes. We're building all these dikes and other structures. So it's a play on that, an opportunity almost to do that physically with our bodies. But then I think it also, or at least I hope, creates a sense of agency, as in I am affecting something. And so same thing with the sound sculptures or installations that I've created. They're not, the emphasis isn't on making sound effects, but rather what I call sound affects, a way that someone can be drawn into thinking about something more complex that involves perhaps all their senses, but really using one or two as a lure. So yeah, I'd start with that.
So sounds like, Lina, that you're using notions of play in different ways to basically create individual links between different people to improvise affects, but then it looks like you're orchestrating the conditions for this play so it could emerge in ways that people could connect.
Yeah.
Not with the spectacle of interactivity, but with these gestural metaphors that you want people to connect to. And yeah, so then, and do you hope for people to basically play through the technology into the metaphor and then into finding themselves as a force that they weren't before through the power of metaphor and poetry, and then rediscovering themselves in a different place and thinking of their place in the ecology?
Yes, I like the way that you put that, because I just keep saying, well, it's not about the tech. Yes, it's cool that it does this when I do that, but it really is about play. It really is about bringing someone somewhere else in an affective way. Absolutely. And then again, creating this sense of agency, which I think is really important in the US right now in this election season, but also, you know, to feel that I can move things. I am connected to other things. So yeah, I really like the way you put it, Navid.
I really think that, especially through sound works, there is, on one hand, everything I agree fully with you, there is a much more interaction, especially in ecological sound artworks, whereby, you know, through the sound of whales in New Zealand, or through the Baltic Sea, microorganisms by Jan Winderen from Norway. I mean, you can go around the world and you have this really involved sound installations, which are also interactive and bring in the audience into a participatory phase.
Yeah, definitely seems like all of our participants here work somewhere strongly with sound, but all of us seem to work with it in multisensory ways. Suzanne, you do sound performances as well as compositions. Can you talk about how you use both sonic but also multisensory entanglements of sound with other modalities to draw in your audience and put them in different perspectives and orchestrating conditions of the senses, and how you bring the senses into this?
Yeah, I think I really like that. I rarely use that word orchestrate, but I think I'm trained as a composer, and I think that word is probably pretty accurate. I mean, the balance that I'm striking when in dealing with an audience, because I think the willingness to engage with an audience is, to me, it's a choice of who my audience is. I'm very interested in the idea of gifting your audience with they have senses, I have senses, but I make a lot of wearable things from my senses. that the audience can either, thinking about ideas of witnessing, but I'm very interested in the idea of gifting, the difference and the decision of whether to gift an audience something or manipulate the audience, which I think are both part of the techniques that I'm interested in. And I think with the senses, but I don't need to, I have so many tools and more than just the senses that I can name in my toolbox as a Lakota person to communicate with the non-human. There's options, and there's traditional ways, there's borderline traditional ways, and mostly to me I see them as extended versions of listening. But the way I work with wearables in my practice is I'm interested in composing systems, computational systems. So I'm composing my listening self and the computer as a maybe machine listening entity. And in that, I'm interested in not only sonifying data, but visualizing data and then eventually tactilizing data, because I feel like the inviting the body in, and with the computer, I just like you said, I also don't like tech demo art. I want to be in relation with the computer and to move within and without this idea of tool, and to put pressure on the idea of tool. But that's not to say that the tool can't also move between animate and inanimate. And my touch point for that is thinking, I was just reading a very old text talking about how this man didn't want to say a certain thing because he would offend his ceremonial outfit. And his ceremonial outfit it's made of other beings and been transformed, and it has the animacy to do something to him if he acts in an appropriate way. And he hadn't even worn it in 50 years, and he was afraid to offend this outfit. And so wearables helps me get there and think through that.
Suzanne, so you talked about gifting your audience something. Often art helps us see something that's right in front of us and we can't. But seeing something is not easy. You need either the right conditions, right modulations, right destabilizations. If I may ask, can you give us an example of what do you give? How do you gift something? Is it a gift of seeing something that's right in front of people? And feel free to answer that question in any way you want. I was just curious.
Yeah, I think performance, I was trained as a classical musician, so that type of performance really feels like I'm giving a gift to the audience. And the act of fully dissolving or disassociating on stage is a big gift. It's a really vulnerable gift. Yes. But as I moved into darker subject matter, into very indigenous subject matter and lived experience as subject matter, I had to be way more careful about what kind of gift I'm giving to the audience. And while I'm interested, and I still haven't really parsed out what that means when installing interactive installations. I'm not sure, because I don't think it's possible to gift my ontology to someone. I can't, and I also can't know what I know and know it for somebody else. Things have to be experienced, and art isn't the whole experience, which is why I really do enjoy exploring the idea of manipulation to get there. And right now I'm thinking things as there's two ways to approach making things or thinking about things. One is the critical way, where I'm thinking, okay, how can I critique something? How can I use a bad thing to do something interesting or good? A bad tool, like my partner Devin Ronnebeck and I are working on face replacement videos and that kind of level of manipulation of the audience. And then on the other hand, when I try to make new objects, new computational sculptures in a good way and try to do them as ethically as possible, that's another approach. So.
Yeah, indeed, these are tricky questions. We're stepping into sensory ethnographies of how do you transport a sense-making assemblage from one culture to another, or should you? What is the other context going to do with what you gifted them, and so forth. thank you for sharing that part of your process with us. This makes me think of something that Jonathan had told me before the panel, and Jonathan's recent workings with AI systems has led him to this realization that some AI systems try to encode culture and use it as content. So we're talking about almost a strange transformation that, sure, it should be permitted, but it should be done in a careful way, because how can you turn culture into content? I won't sum up the whole project too much because Jonathan can speak about that or anything else he wants, but would you like to talk about the senses and their context and what happens when they're disembodied and packaged and repurposed for use? That being an example of inappropriate. Sorry, go on.
Thank you. And sorry about the light in here. I could do better.
You look great.
I didn't. Thanks. I try. Well, so almost all of my scholarship has engaged with this question of the senses, and I guess I don't use it disembodiment a lot because I think it's all some kind of embodiment. It's just a question of what kind of body and what kind of arrangement. And so my last book was a history of the MP3 format. And I was very interested in like the reason MP3s were smaller than standard like CD audio files was that they encoded this idea of what the listener doesn't hear or cannot hear in a signal. And so the book was really a history of where that idea came from. It's built into almost all of our telecommunication systems. But the way that sensing is encoded into AI, I think is quite different, and it's something I'm still sorting out and really thinking about, right? So we normally think about digital systems as if they process sound or image, they're hearing for us or they're seeing for us. But there's a way in which one of the primary sort of tenets of big data, and it's actually really politically problematic, is this idea that data are data and can be converted into from one thing to another. You know, in the sound world, there was a lot of great work on sonification of turning data into sound, either for scientific or for aesthetic purposes. And of course, there's a long history of visualizing sound, and in fact, speech identification still basically uses sound epistemologies developed around the sound spectrogram, which is a very 20th century technology. But I don't think we've really come to grips with what it means to say that an AI system sees or hears when the system itself is agnostic about the sense data, and the entire, I'd say, intellectual structure of computer science is built around it, and even built around very direct signal processing applications, like plugins you can use for audio programs to sort of automatically mix or master your music. Like even there's this sort of agnosticism about what sound is and even what music is that I think on one level, sure, as a scholar, I like that. But on a political level, you have to set that against the fact that we used to talk about music and art and journalism and poetry and literature and painting and sculpture and installations and video and all these things. But the way digital companies talk about them is as content, as if that's not the valuable or meaningful thing, that the meaningful thing is the conduit. From a business standpoint, that may very well be, but nobody goes on Facebook because they're really interested in the back end or they're like profit-making apparatus. They go because they want to engage with their friends and the people they're connected to. And so it's that sort of very old notion of culture as connected, as repeated, and even the textual notion of culture as like something that's held in a text or an object, I think is really important and something that AI technologies have not yet fully reckoned with. And I'll stop there.
I can't hear you.
Seems like we're in the world of AI naturally, so we'll focus on that for a little bit. And I understand we have some questions from the audience as well that we'll bring in. So AI has certain dominant ideologies, and just so our audience knows, particularly Suzanne and Jonathan, both in their recent works, work with AI systems or try to work either against AI systems to make them better or with AI systems to make them better. And they both probably have uncovered sneaky structures of repression and have tried to turn them around their head. And by now, in the discussion, the questions of Cartesian dualism and how this AI ideology has taken that and made that unproductive but productive for the economy has come up. I understand in Suzanne's work, for example, she thinks about how to make anything ethical at all. We need to think about its material conditions. And AI systems sometimes at least give the users this impression that magic is happening without material consequences. In Jonathan, we see, and what Jonathan was talking about, we see that sometimes thinking via these AI systems, for example, such as Landor, we could see that AI and big data algorithms and machine learning need to basically be sense-making apparatuses. And investigation of them might find us that we might want to ask, does AI place perception and the senses in nature as already existing and detaching them from autopoietically intentional bodies? And what happens when we do that, as Jonathan was saying? Suzanne, so you were talking about how to make things in your recent article that you published in, I believe the title of the article is How to Build Anything Ethically, published in the Indigenous Protocols and AI book. And you go into that about transporting the knowledge of the people you're from and close to you to other people that would use it, and talking about the materiality of AI systems. Yeah, so I wanted you to perhaps talk about, do you see a way forward with AI that we could go beyond its dualism and connect better with both these material conditions and can we build better metaphors of what is intelligence also within AI systems that are not locked into this dominant ideology that we're in? What's the way forward you see?
Well, I see a lot of ways forward. Actually, it's one thing I'm actually pretty optimistic about. You know, and one of the things, I mean, the question of what is intelligence is, I think, very, very key, because it is called artificial intelligence, and only from the history that artificial intelligence comes by would people so want to put intelligence on that pedestal. So I think that's kind of where I start. And I draw from writers such as, thinking about a Leroy Littlebear paper called The Anatomy of the Blackfoot Word. And it really, that article really highlights to me that, you know, there were at least 500 languages, even more. And I mean, there's thousands of languages just in North America and dialects, which carried with them their ontologies and epistemologies and ways of engaging with intelligence and even defining intelligence. Or in the case of the Lakota, saying intelligence is down here, and the qualities that make something animate or worthy of being a being or worthy of relation are way up here. That intelligence is not a mystery. It's very knowable. So therefore, it's not sacred. And I'm taking some of this information from a writer called David Posthumus. And in that, I mean, that's what helps me get to ideas of, starting to approach AI. And so one thing that I'm totally for is the anthropomorphizing of AI. I think it's a great starting point for a lot of people, especially people who are making these things, who on one hand, it's beneficial to use those metaphors to sell products. And on the other hand, they're like, no, there's absolutely nothing animate. And if you think there's something animate about this, then you completely misunderstand. But I think it's a great opening point to say, well, what happens if we were to take a completely different ontology, such as a Lakota ontology, Ojibwe ontology and say the materials which make up the, let's say, the physical computing device that houses the AI, and say, I want to have a relationship with materials and the place that those come from. That's a great place to start. Yeah, and I think it's important. I think it's very interesting, and it's part of my technique of performance and manipulation to say, what's the similarity between Indian magic, which isn't a real thing, and the magic behind computers? Can I do both at once? Is it hilarious? Is it really dark? So that's how I approach that performatively.
Thank you. So we have one more provocation, and we also have questions from the audience, and we have 40 minutes maximum. That sounds like we can manage to do all of those. Should we go to the next provocation, or should we pull from any questions from the audience? Lina, given that you're looking at the audience's questions, what do you think?
Yes, I mean, we can address some of the questions because I think they're relevant to the topics that we've been discussing now. And so,
okay, why don't we put one or two of them together on the most relevant, and then we will address more at the end.
So let me just try to read this. So, I mean, a more general one was, what is the role of space in this process? So I think we often tend to separate space and things, or time and space. And then another general comment that I think is relevant that I'll just echo is for Barad, there is no separation of objects from interactions. And I think that definitely relates to the way that Suzanne was talking about animating objects as a way to also emphasize our relationships with these objects. And so this person who commented, it was Anna Roakowitz, I think brought up Barad, and that would be very productive to maybe think with. And then someone wanted Suzanne to elaborate on the light cones. So I don't know if we can do that before moving forward. And then I'd say the last sort of set of questions are talking about content existing as an object or as a proxy for a description of relations. So this sort of, and same person asking about, the medium and the message. So this might go back to Jonathan. So those are maybe quite a few. I can repeat and go back and see what the chat said.
That seems plenty. I don't know which
those
one.
Those are good, and I want to hear about light cones too.
Yeah, those sounded really cool. Agreed.
Yeah, perhaps we could hear about that briefly.
Sure. Yeah, I can just give the quick. I just wrote something about light cones, but I have a piece called "Everything I Say Is True," which deals with the light cones. So light cones are a theory from Minkowski, who was a teacher of Einstein's at some point, and that's about the distance that a flash of light can travel, and once it's emitted. But interestingly enough, those Kipembe, those light twisters, also look very much like a 3D light cone, where the 3D shape is, to me, also the distance by the transmission of the communication from the person listening to the beyond being listened to. So that's coming from Lakota astronomy texts that I've been reading. So.
Thank you, Suzanne. And we have, if the tech operators are able to hear us, can you make sure that Suzanne or the relevant person speaking is on the screen, or else everyone just at once? I don't know if anyone's there. Yeah. Otherwise, Lina will have to make impressions as if everything's coming through you.
I think that's how people are viewing it on the other window that I have open. That's where I'm reading the chat. It seems to be just me, so I can try to mime or lip sync everyone else's, but I can't see your faces anymore, which is kind of sad.
Lina, since you're on the screen,
we need some puppets.
since you're on the screen already and questions of relationality and relations came in, I will leeway to our third topic and leading to a questions for you, Lina. So our third, can everyone hear me clearly, first of all?
Yes.
Okay, so our third question is about questions of power, systems, and structures. Structures of power invisibly work within us and via the fabrics of colonial language, gear code, and space and time. And sometimes you have to brush against the limits of what's possible to go against those grains. And sometimes we're successful in doing so by using powers of relations and metaphors. And so for Lina, the way this theme relates to your work, and given that people wanted to know about relations and relationality, when you compose multisensory metaphors, which I understand you do your work sometimes, for example, between a priori gesture and media, relationally and via responsive technologies, how do you deal with capitalism's tendency of enfolding back of interactivity back into its core of operating functions? Do you provoke your audience to interact? How do you provoke your audience not to interact with the interactivity as this engaging, entertaining thing, and instead with your poetic metaphors that destabilize the relations of audiences and ecology?
Okay. Yes. I think I often feel limited with what I can do using particular tools. And I feel like your question brings up this interesting notion also of power or co-opting certain things for other purposes. I want to encourage that, a kind of hacking, right? Something was made for something, I'm going to use it for something else or allow other people to use it in a different way. So working with particular tools can feel both limiting, but also really expansive. And same thing with working with, a team of people who can show me what they've been working on and say, hey, I can do this thing now. And then that just sort of creates this explosion of possibilities. But one of the throws, and this might go back to this idea of relationships with technologies and them being animate or inanimate, but when in the throes of a frustrating moment using particular tools, I'll often say, but these tools were made by people. And so that becomes something that's also important to me. I did a lot of field work in, yes, I can see you all again, field work in England and in the UK at Microsoft Research. This was over 10 years ago, but I remember being sort of stunned at how the design process, it's very human, and people are there to make claims. They make tools and then they make claims about those tools, and then they test them on users and come back and say, well, because of the way that people use these tools, we should make this purple. And that was somewhat shocking to me. And it's a different sort of world, perhaps, in art and design, or the idea of building functional tools that do something. And this maybe goes back to co-opting content, where, again, we're using culture or human behavior or user studies as a way to justify the making of a technology in a particular way. And so spending time with people at Microsoft Research, but also other designers of some of these technologies, really helped me remember that these tools are, again, made by people with particular purposes in mind, and that those things kind of get co-opted by different groups that have different stakes. And so as an artist, I use things in a particular way that it might not have been meant to be used. And then I hope my audience will also engage my piece or the elaborate sort of choreography or setting that I've created, this place for engagement, in their own way. And so there's maybe this sort of questioning of control, both our control within our environment and within these art pieces, but also how technologies are even designed in the first place. I don't know. It's a lot of questions that your questions have raised.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Lina. So, Suzanne, a variation of this theme for you. You were mentioning that to do what you wish to do and that you do successfully, you sometimes have to use a range of technologies, from semiotics and language itself to the technologies for conditioning sensory engagement for your audiences and participants. But this means that you have to use some things that already exist, including language. So which means that you're often probably finding yourself brushing against the limits of what's possible. Being that some of your goal is to bypass the systems of powers and structures of power that are in place and destabilize them and introduce new modulations into it by using those systems to begin with, because what else can we do? So this what else can we do and what strategies have helped you would be of interest for us and other artists to know about, of how do you go through past the paradoxical notions of discourse and language and technology and technique and through to the other side to create at least a moment of engagement that stands out for you.
Yeah, I mean, we come up with these limits a lot, and so the limits of what I think finding the limits is what I'm interested in. Finding the edge, finding where the thing can be broken first, where things are not possible first, is definitely where I focus in on and I'm most interested in, and especially in coming out of a place where I was using like kind of using technology to be critical, which I found to be it's almost too easy. So then we were challenging ourselves with this piece. It's actually part of ISEA, which is called Telling Rock, or Little Picture. We have a couple names for it, and it's a sculpture. And in making that sculpture, we challenged ourselves to like, can we do this in a good way? And after I'd kind of theorized like all these rivers that lead to a body of water that is a whole good thing, all the protocols necessary in order to make something in a good way, I was like, it's impossible, because I don't even know where the metals come from in a simple computer part that I need to make this possible. So, but just like the frameworks that I'm using, we're trying to do something in an ethical way. When the frameworks, they wouldn't just give up. Just because you can't do a ceremony in the perfect way possible doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you're going to do your best. And I think coming from that, when we were trying to do that, the things that were total failures in making this sculpture in a good way were the materials. Absolute failure. No idea where the metal's coming from. I can guess. But I have no idea where those mines are. But on the successful part was the naming and communication protocols, which we followed the Lakota protocols for that sculpture. But that is also a failure, and a very interesting failure, because even though we asked this computer part what its name was, and we wrote a song in a very more traditional listening capacity for the piece to speak, it can't be named traditionally, because it's not a traditional part of the family. There's no it's not actually, we're right on that edge. Like, just because we're doing the right thing doesn't mean it's the right thing. And I think that made it really exciting and total failure.
Yeah, looks like we're all working towards a future, and we're doing what we can do now to at least prepare everything and the conditions for this better future to emerge. But we have to brush against the limits and the edges of things. And from what I'm hearing, for everyone, the work never stops, from where we get our pieces of metal to how we code. Someone might want to make a non-linear dynamical systems, but you add a computer to it, and there's a finite system in there to help you make a non-linear dynamical system. So the paradoxes are plenty, and then as artists, we make and choose what is the most effective thing that we can do in a moment for our goals. Jonathan, Nina, would you like to add or comment about whether these thresholds and piercing through structures of control and having moments of going beyond, or would you like to talk about something else as we go forward in this theme?
I would like to say that it is interesting how today, when we have brand new, very intriguing technologies, we sometimes, in certain projects, mix old analog technologies and very new ones. I am just part of something now, which is right now is shown in Eco-Data Festival in Riga, and we have a big group. And on one hand, there are some very new ideas about 3D on-screen drawing, but we also have a pinhole camera making part, and we have a Cree dancer who's dancing with a tree, but we filmed it with a drone camera. And so it's I think this is a very interesting direction to move towards, where we recall some historical tools and objects, but we reuse them in a different way. I don't know whether other people are exposed or do something like that.
Yeah, certainly some older technologies don't have the limitations of finite machines, so to speak. So it helps to bring analog in, so then the people who do things can break the system, and breaking the system is sometimes what we want to happen. Yes. Jonathan, have you broken the system, the AI systems and the big data, and make the big data feel funny and get through it to the other side, whatever getting through to the other side might have meant for you in a searching context?
I'm sure I've said terrible things that hurt its feelings terribly, but I don't think I've broken anything. I actually wanted to comment on that sort of persistence of the analog argument.
Yes.
Because even in the most digital technologies, processes, physical processes are going on, material processes are going on, right? We're pretty much past now that there are all these data centers sucking up all this energy, I think we're past this like imagined immateriality of data. That was sort of a thing for a while. But like even like on the motherboard of a computer, I was always fascinated that for years, the voltage difference between off and on was 0 and 5 volts, which is the gate voltage in an analog synthesizer. It's exactly the same switching voltage. Now it's like 3.5 volts or something like that. But it's like even there, you're dealing with a sort of analogic logic, as it were, inside this digital machine. Now, if you talk to a theoretical computer scientist, they'll say, well, that doesn't matter. It's really about the math. But that's, again, I mean, that goes back to Catherine's point about this sort of overvaluing of intelligence in the head and the brain, as if the math could exist apart from its manifestations, right? One position says the concrete is only available in the abstract, but I think an ecological position is the opposite, that the abstract's only available in the concrete. So I think that there's very much to be gained from not falling into the trap of the sort of ideology of technological progress. I mean, that's the other thing about AI. So much of it is actually old, right? Like the most important innovation that made AI possible was not, better graphics cards or training artificial neural networks to behave differently. It was massive amounts of data that could be then run through statistical routines that are very, like the statistical reasoning behind AI is very 20th century mainstream stats. It's not a new way of thinking about the world or representing the world. And in fact, in some cases, it's quite regressive, as when computer scientists publish papers that look like the kind of phrenology that Hegel was already critiquing at the beginning of the 19th century. So I think we're still very much in a moment where we're sorting this out. But again, sort of attacking the ideology of progress, I think, is really important. And the belief in inevitability or inevitabilism, that this stuff is all going to take over everything. Precisely what we see with, the analog revivals that are happening obviously in music, but you also see it in all sorts of different arts practices right now, is that other technologies persist. And I think the challenge going forward is to let those things persist without sending them through the valley of obsolescence, where most of them get thrown out and wind up in landfills. So I'll stop there. But I definitely have not broken any AI systems to my knowledge.
Well, thank you for that comment.
I think that's interesting. Can I just comment on Jonathan's comment, basically about this faith in technology? That was something also I encountered a lot when working with these different designers who were trying to create these memory devices that would basically help our failing human memories. And I set up tools. I've got notes and sticky notes everywhere because I have a very fallible human memory. But it's this. I don't know if you can, did I cut out right there?
Yeah, but you're back.
Okay. And so it's this assumption that, you know, with Moore's law, that we can pack more and more, and pretty soon we'll have your entire life recorded on a grain of sand that you can wear, et cetera. And so I found myself pushing back on this. But I wonder what your comments are, again, with this sort of, there's this like thrust, like it's this wave that we have to ride and believe in. Yeah, more equals more, exactly.
Yeah. This idea. Yeah. So I love that you, I mean, I think we have to be careful, like with designers, like you want them to believe in progress in the same way that you want English teachers to believe in grammar. Like I think that's okay in a way, but when it's this broader cultural or political thing, I get really nervous. I think you're absolutely right about the Moore's law thing, though. I mean, for one thing, it's not a law. It was basically a prescription which people tried to fill. It's long since no longer been the case because of physics. People forget that the next section of the paper after the density doubling argument was called heat problem. I wasn't the first person to notice that at all. I'm just repeating something I've read a bunch of times. You know, and sure enough, there's a heat problem.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think this sort of, on one hand, faith in progress, and the other, like, so needing to produce a belief in progress that actually things that aren't new have to be obfuscated as if they're new is part of the problem, right? One of the things I'm very interested in is fake AI. There's a number of important books that have come out in recent years, Ghost Work. I'm forgetting the name of Tarleton Gillespie's book. But all these books that show that these things that seem to be seamless and automatic are actually very much driven by human labor, often poorly compensated. And that's a really important part of the system too, right? So that's another way in which, like, people want the technology to be something more than it is. Maybe someday it will be, but the fact that it's not and you're hiding it is in fact part of the problem.
Yes, we're driven to create content instead of, and we're driven to, the culture wants things to be concrete. And I'm reminded by a quote that says, concrete is as concrete doesn't. I think it's James Vayamasumi, or a thing is when it's not doing. So sometimes to give something to culture, not to culture, give something to economy, we need to create concrete things, and that means that sapping the life out of it and turn it into a thing that's not doing. So it could be concrete because it's not anymore, or it does not anymore. Susan, did you have any remarks about the topic of systems within AI and concreteness versus liquidness of processes? Or else we could also address any questions that might have came up for Lina from the audience. I would let you two think.
I mean, I think what was said was really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, just to respond to what I was thinking about Jonathan's remarks about hidden human labor, is to me, whenever anybody is allowed, if their logic can allow, if an ontology can allow a person to dehumanize another person, then it's just like a house of cards or a domino effect. Or once you can choose to say, oh, so this is non-human, or the land is not is not a being, or the material, the mining materials or the miners are not beings, or the people we're collecting data from are not beings. You can do it to everything. And I think that Silicon Valley, to me, I mean, it's like I work in this AI, I think about AI, but it's just one symptom of an entire world-building logic of colonization, imperialism, extraction. They're all part of the same ontology that started somewhere and said, some people aren't humans. Some things aren't being enough to count, to be part of our relation, to be in ethical relationships with. We'll only treat them as our slaves or our tools or our object. And that happens to a lot of people in this world. And it's part of one logic to me, in my opinion.
Raymond Williams wrote a great short text about, well, it's not that short, but ideas of nature and how we have come to separate ourselves from nature so that it becomes this thing that we can extract. So yeah, I agree, Suzanne, with what you're saying, this sort of separation and not a being, not in a relationship with, and therefore something that we can act on.
Yeah, one thing I've learned today is that there are some deep questions for all of us designers, artists, and scholars that can't be answered. And to try to do what we do, we can't rely on what pre-exists. So we have to constantly come up with alternative ways of finding a way, no matter how legitimate it is already or not methodologically or within a pre-existing language, finding a way to tap into systems of relations and introducing and injecting new ways of doing things. So wrapping it up around there, seeing that we have roughly 15 minutes left till we cut off, not that we need to use all the time that we have, I wanted to first know if there's any particular notes that stand out that we should address from the audience. Lina?
Yes, there is. I mean, I listed a lot of the questions, but I think we can go back, and there's another one that's kind of a follow-up, or asking if we can emphasize the relationality in objects without emphasizing utility, considering utility as exploitation in a capitalist context. So I feel that might relate to our conversations, the latter part that we've been having. So I can sort of repeat that. So can we emphasize relationality in objects without emphasizing utility, considering utility as exploitation in a capitalist context? I am just the conduit here of the question.
Can I object to the premise of the question?
I think so. It's from an audience member.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your question, first of all, and thanks to everybody who asked questions. I'm sorry we won't get to hear or interact with you about them. The reason I object to the premise of the question, I agree that capitalism is all about sort of instrumentalism, but I also don't want to live in an entirely non-utility, non-instrumental world. I think instrumentality is also really important for care, for stewardship, for dependency. And you can think about that in really complex systems, or you can think about that in really interpersonal ways. And so for me, when I think about objects have all sorts of relations with one another independent of their utility to humans or animals or other things. But to me, an ethical relationship with the things we call objects doesn't necessarily require abandoning utility. It needs to ask utility for what and for whom. And so to back off the sort of critique of all instrumentalism to say instrumentalization is a part of life. It just can't be the reason for life or the purpose for something or something to which something is reduced. I'll stop there.
Yeah, correct. I would say that plus replacing the thing in the sentence or the question or the object with this concreteness with matters of process and the thing, the sentience-ness of the thing or those processes that we're talking about, and trying to work with them. We have 10 minutes left. I wanted to note that Nina from Leonardo and OCAD and University of Toronto, I believe, initiated this event, and then we put this group together. And given that all of us come with rich backgrounds, we've been able to have such a rich conversation. Nina, do you have any things you wanted to, that came up for you that you wanted to share with us?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you because you have done so much for getting this going and to be alive. That's very, and I really enjoyed listening to everybody because we all come from, in a way, a different corner, and that was really very refreshing. I also would like to say that, for example, what Jonathan was just saying in his last comments, I really agree with that. And I really think that we need to humanize more even our technological work or connected to technology. Even things like today, everybody of us is constantly drawing in Zoom meetings and Skype meetings, but even those could be humanized to a certain extent. I'm saying that from a position where I work in many countries, and it is this humanizing aspect which keeps me going, and I think it keeps you all going as well. So thank you very much, and I really learned a lot, but I'm not so good about quickly summarizing it.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you. That's a good summary. We're all coming from new materialist perspectives, but that doesn't mean that we need to stop humanizing things when it helps.
Yeah, well, in this new order we live in, I think, but my problem is a lot of rhetoric which goes on, which has very little behind it, and the generalizations of various issues, which are actually absolutely differently experienced in a local context. And that's often forgotten. But this was just the opposite.
Yeah, this was very particular in so many ways instead of general. And I believe I like to say thank you to everyone and slowly wrap this up. How does everyone feel about that? Okay, well, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Lina. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, ISEA. It's been, the connection we've made will continue growing, both amongst ourselves and perhaps within our audience. And to our audience, most of us haven't been active on the online platform yet, being the first day of ISEA, but I will personally go there tomorrow and see what's happening and catch up.
And it is the first totally online ISEA. According to my age, I was already there in Montreal in '95 at the ISEA, but this is a new method.
Yeah, me and Nina persisted that this should happen as a live discussion. So what you're saying hasn't been recorded. I could do anything now. It's going to be the first moment it happens, including us saying goodbye to you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you guys for organizing.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks for all your organizing.
Thank you.